Hey, hi everybody. Right about now you're probably thinking, what is the WTO and how do you spell it? Well, the first part is a little bit complicated, but I'm going to make it easy for you. And the second part is WTO. Alright, so let's get into it. So we're talking about the World Trade Organization, and so we'll cover some terms and I'll give you some background and explain a little bit about how it works, and we'll discuss pros and cons and then get into some conclusions. Okay, so the first thing then about terms is let's discuss what fair trade is. So fair trade is an agreement between two or more nations. So it could be there's unilateral and then there's multilateral. Unilateral is between two, multi is between many. Okay, so the idea here is to remove barriers to imports and exports amongst the members. So with a free trade agreement, the policy, goods, services, all these things can be bought and sold across these borders, international borders, with little or no government tariffs. So the idea of reducing tariffs and little to no quotas or subsidies or prohibitions, all these things that could inhibit the exchange of materials. And all of that's because when one country adopts a tariff, then the other has a retaliatory tariff, and then it goes on, and then what ends up happening is that everybody loses. So there's lots of research on this, and which ultimately led to the creation of the WTO. So, but I want you to understand here that free trade is not the same as fair trade. Okay, so fair trade is a different term. So fair trade is about equity, and it's about equity in international trade. So perhaps you've been to the grocery store, you've bought bananas or coffee, and you've seen a fair trade label on it. So it meant that these standards were met about equity. So fair trade contributes to sustainable development because it offers better trading conditions, because it works on securing the rights of marginalized producers and workers. So it basically, what it does is provide more money and more rights and better working conditions for people that harvest these particular types of products. So coffee and chocolate and bananas are three of them, and we'll discuss all those later in the course. Okay, so but remember, free trade is not the same as fair trade. Okay, so why would we even consider free trade? Well, mostly it's about money, right? Big surprise there, huh? So when you have free trade, there's more exports and there's more imports. So that means there's many who can win from this. So it's seen that there's more positive than negatives with free trade. So what it does then, because you have more exchange of products, more people have more access to higher quality goods and lower price goods, right? And it reduces cost overall because you have more competition, and because there's competition through capitalism, there's competition to improve efficiency and innovation in products. So why would the WTO want to increase trade? Well, the first one should be pretty obvious, because there are opportunities for more profit for more companies, right? It's corporations that largely drive this. And then there's more altruistic reasons, that if you can provide more goods and services at lower costs, you can raise living standards of people, right? And that when you have these open markets, there's more competition, and so you get overall consumer benefits. Now, some of us, hear about this kind of thing and we think, oh, well, I don't believe it. It can't be true. Yet you'll be at the store and you'll buy stuff that you don't even realize has been imported and that the prices are low. For example, if you go to some of these stores, you'll see incredibly low prices on t-shirts and other types of textiles, and that's because of open trade, free trade that's been happening. So we've all been benefiting from lower costs, although it's not always obvious. So this competition's good, because and it is only enabled because of tariffs being removed. So now what comes into play is another term, the law of comparative advantage. So comparative advantage, this is when you have this a pursuit of trade that will, bottom line is that that companies will look for advantages to reduce their cost, and in reducing their cost, that gives them a larger advantage in the marketplace. So there's a bunch of components to that, but the bottom line is that it is about the pursuit of profit, right? They're looking for increased market share, and so they can make more money, right? Now another term, and we'll talk more about comparative advantage in just a bit, but another term is trade liberalization. That can be a confusing term, but really all it means is removal or reduction of restrictions or barriers on the free exchange of goods between nations, right? So what would these barriers be that are removed or reduced through trade liberalization? Well, the first one, of course, would be tariffs, right? So tariffs are taxes. They're basically a tax on an imported good. So if a good comes into, let's say, the Port of Oakland, then there would be a tax that would be put on it, and usually those taxes are put on to protect the domestic producers of a particular good. And so countries, in fact, do not like tariffs, and free trade has basically been designed to remove tariffs. So trade liberalization reduces or eliminates tariffs. And then there are other things, other barriers, and these are non-tariff barriers, or things that are not these taxes on imported goods, and those include things like licensing rules or quotas. Quotas are very important because it's about, you may only allow a certain amount of a particular type of product or service to come into a country, and once you reach that level, now you have reached your quota. So the idea is to also remove those. The challenge with this is that sometimes you have countries that do what's called dumping. So they have lots of product and then they bring it into a country at an extraordinarily low price, and then to essentially take over the market. But there's issues about how countries can argue that this in fact is a illegal practice under the free trade rules, meaning dumping. So more on that later too. Okay, so what's happened then with tariff rates? Well, tariff rates, as you can see here, have declined greatly, right, in the recent decades, and this is because of the WTO, and it was because of the awareness of economists and political leaders that tariffs really aren't good for anybody, not good for any country. So there's been a drastic reduction in tariffs, this I suppose it'd be a subjective opinion, but it's generally recognized as a good thing. All right, so about the WTO, the World Trade Organization. What is this thing? So it's an international organization, and what it does is that it deals with the global rules of trade. So it creates the rules and enforces those rules. So why should you care about the WTO? Maybe you've never heard of it, or maybe you kind of have, but you don't know what it means. Well, you should care about it because it's not just big, it's enormous. It affects about almost all of the global trade, over 97%. So nearly every country in the world is part of it, all of them but about 16. And so the key thing to remember is that what the WTO does is that it determines the rules of trade. And the rules of trade then affect people and the planet, right? So that's why this course is about the environment and global trade. And here is the key player right here, the World Trade Organization and its impact on people and the planet. So some general facts about the WTO. It was established in January of 1995. It's located in Geneva, Switzerland. There's about 600 people that staff it. It has a director general who runs the thing. He's the boss, or she's the boss, and that person is selected by the General Council, which is made up of all of the WTO members. The WTO oversees about 60 different agreements as of 2020, and whenever there are agreements that are created, member countries sign and ratify these agreements. Okay, so it has to be voted on and elected and acted on by member countries. So a little bit of history here. So after World War II, there was the Bretton Woods Conference. That was in 1944, and it was basically a recognition by economic leaders and people that came from war. In particular, there were the generals that were involved, and there was President Truman who was there, and General George Marshall, who had been the chief of staff during World War II. He was in charge of the military forces in World War II in the United States. He was pushing for this, and so it became this. They adopted the seminal concept that we should have international open markets, because economic markets, if we create them so that there's interdependency, that one country will rely on another, that could reduce the threat of war. So the idea is that economics and economic situations can increase the possibilities of war. And in fact, they believed that was one of the causes of World War II, things that led to basically putting Hitler in power, was because of economics. And there's some truth to that, but we're not going to get into all that theory. And this concept about connecting us more through economics is even more important since nuclear weapons were introduced in World War II, the dropping of the atomic bomb on Nagasaki and Hiroshima in Japan. So the Bretton Woods Conference created GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was the predecessor to the WTO. They also established the International Monetary Fund, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Redevelopment, which became the World Bank, and we've discussed those in a previous lecture. Okay, so there was a need to evolve GATT into something else, and so over a period of about 8 years, there was discussions about how to do that, and it was called the Uruguay Round. And yes, they met in Uruguay, and so they saw that there was more globalization, and that so that we needed that there was a need to evolve GATT. So that happened in 1994. The WTO was officially established under what was called the Marrakesh Agreement, and yes, you guessed it again correctly, that they met in Marrakesh, and that's where they made the decision. Okay, so the actions that accompanied that was also to reduce tariffs, to adopt anti-dumping laws so that there's not one country taking advantage of another by dumping a bunch of products into it. Dumping, by the way, again, is when products are being sold by foreign firms in the U.S. or other countries at less than fair value. So they might be selling things at less than their cost, and oftentimes that's done strictly to take market share. Okay, so and then the other thing that happened then was the removal of non-tariff trade barriers. So this would be restrictions of imports that are not in the form of a tariff, things like quotas that we discussed earlier. So the WTO then replaces GATT in 1995. So it starts about a year after Marrakesh Agreement. And there's voluntary membership by member nations. And the goals are free trade, zero tariffs, open competition. And GATT was expanded, expanded the GATT agreement to include trade and services and protections of intellectual property, which, by the way, is still heavily debated today. It's not believed that it goes nearly far enough, or at least the current agreements. The other thing is that the WTO does is that it cooperates with the IMF and World Bank, which we discussed earlier, and other multinational organizations, including the United Nations, to achieve greater coherence in global economic policy making. So it's rules-based, member-driven. Decisions are made by member governments. The rules are the outcomes of negotiations among members, so they're not just created by the leader, it's created by the entire group. And it strives for consensus. So in other words, it tries to have everyone work together and then have everyone agree before they pass something. So you might think, as I do with us, is that, oh my gosh, this sure takes a long time, right, to make all this stuff happen. So I heard it said once that the fruits of government ripen slowly. So yes, this can go very slowly. After all, it took 8 years to convert GATT into the WTO. All right, and that was nearly 50 years after GATT was created. So the other thing that WTO has is official sanctioning capabilities. So it can administer and police free trade practices. So it creates these rules, right? And then it has the ability then to sanction countries that don't follow them. And countries can, of course, have a dispute. And when they have a dispute with one country or other countries that they trade with, they bring that to the WTO, which makes decisions. The WTO has been criticized as having weak enforcement powers. And that's a bit of an academic debate that we will not get into. So, qualities of trade that we learned from World War II and from years and years and years of capitalism is that a trading system should be free of discrimination. It should tend toward more freedom. Predictability is something that markets always like, and so that creates stability. There should be more competition because competition drives down prices, and it should be more accommodating for less developed countries. Now what you might see here is what's missing, right? And that is labor rights and environmental protection, right? And so these are two critical things that were not considered to any great depth of detail when the WTO was created. So the principles of the WTO trading system include that it created a framework for negotiating, right, between countries, trade policies, and setting rules. And it created this dispute system. And then it has these 5 principles which we'll go through now. Okay, so the first one, I'm sorry, I'll get into those 5 principles in just a bit. As we talked about, that the WTO promotes trade by reducing and removing trade barriers, by promoting trade liberalization and multilateral trading, and resolving disputes. So here's a diagram about how the WTO is set up, right? Um, so we're not going to get into any depth of detail with this, but the key thing perhaps to understand here is that this ministerial conference, it sounds like a big important word, but basically what it means is that it's the whole group, all of them, and basically they meet about every other year, a minimum of about every other year. So who are these people? Well, they are what we call the stakeholders, who has everyone that has an interest in the WTO and trade, in particular global trade. So corporations are there and governments are there, and they are there to render their opinions, right? So some interests are going to be for profit, right, to maintain or expand their interest in profit, and others are going to be there thinking about the survival of their economies and their people. And then you have others that will be looking at environmental protection issues and labor rights. So these stakeholders will have points of views. Unions, people that represent workers, family farms versus corporate farms and corporate agriculture. There's environmentalists, there's national NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and you have, of course, government representatives. So the modern era of global trade included these policies that drove exceptional growth in world trade, right? That is one of the key things to understand, is that total trade today is well over 22 times the rate of trade that was in 1950, just after World War II. So GATT and the WTO has greatly increased trade, and has created a strong, prosperous trading system that has contributed to this unprecedented economic growth. So here's a graph that shows you this massive increase in trade. And this also means massive consumption of products and goods, right? So there's been, again, more people, more consumption of goods, more trading of goods, and so this diagram helps show that. Okay, so here are these 5 principles of the trading system. So with the WTO, so the first is non-discrimination. So there's 2 major parts of that, and this is the really important part: most favored nation status, right? So perhaps you've heard of this in the news and that when they're talking about trade. But the MFN rule requires that a WTO member must apply the same conditions on trade with all other members. So that means no special favors for anybody, right? And if you bottom line is that you have to treat all of these countries that have MFN the same, right? So that's essentially what it means. Okay, so some of the others are reciprocity, right? So for a nation to negotiate, the gain from negotiation has to be greater than the gain that would be from the concessions, right? So in other words, there has to be a benefit to everybody. Binding and enforceable commitments, transparency. Transparency is really important because what it means is that nations have to publish their trade, the amount of trade, volumes of trade, respond to requests for information by other nations, and notify any country of changes in trade policies. So it's about that every country knows what everyone else is doing. So transparency is very important. There's some things about safety values that governments have this ability to restrict trade based on some measures about the environment, the public, and animal health, right? So health issues. Some exceptions, as we discussed this right there was about environmental protection and national security and some other goals. But the bottom line with any of these exceptions is that they always require interpretation, because some of these exceptions that are created can be questioned as to their validity. And so when member countries disagree, they can then take those disagreements to a dispute board. All right, so another thing, just going back a little bit about competitive advantage. And what is competitive advantage? It's this advantage of competitors that's gained by offering consumers greater value by means of lowering prices or providing greater benefits that justifies a higher price. So companies are always looking at this. So some examples of creating a competitive advantage for an industry is to have access to natural resources that are restricted to competitors. So in other words, the competitors don't have these resources, but you do, right? Having access to highly skilled labor. An example of that is where we live here in Silicon Valley, the San Francisco Bay Area. There's a lot of highly skilled labor here, and that's why the electronics business has been flourishing here for decades. Other examples are the geographic location, so it might be easier to get to ports and have access to transportation, having access to new technology or a proprietary technology that can help drive down cost. So for an example of that is robots that can manufacture things at a much lower cost. And so the next would be ability to manufacture products at a lower cost. There's the importance of brand image recognition. This is very important these days, because if a brand starts to do something that is exploitive to people or the environment, it can very quickly get out into social media, and that brand can crash and burn in a matter of days or weeks, very quickly. So industry is becoming more aware of that threat and the need to protect the image of their brands. And all of this, of course, leads to this other last one, which is perhaps the most important, is reducing their cost, right? And the costs are throughout the entire supply chain, which you've had a lecture on, right? So the production, labor, transportation, wherever you can reduce those costs, you can get yourself a competitive advantage. So without controls, though, some of these competitive advantages can create exploitation. So when cost is the driving force, exploitation of any kind to keep products and service costs low can then create this problem. So environmental exploitation and poverty issues can be used for competitive advantage. I'm not saying that it's good. I'm just saying that it could be done. There's nothing that makes it illegal, right, to seek competitive advantage, and that when we don't value the environment and people as much as what we should, and do that through laws, right, then it becomes available for exploitation. So the pursuit of profits without restraints, let's put it that way, leads to exploitation, which leads to a race to the bottom. And a race to the bottom means we start to deplete the environment, we create greater poverty, we create greater divides between the richer and the poor, and then we create those social problems, and we do this through the demands of competitive advantage to create more profit for certain industries. So this race to the bottom then becomes this competitive state, right, where a company or a state or even a nation is attempting to undercut the competition's prices by sacrificing quality standards or worker safety, lower wages, and environmental standards. And this can happen between regions or between nations. And when I mean regions, we have it happening in our own country where you'll have states or regions that will offer a corporate tax breaks to locate in their area because it will create jobs, but then that exploits other people because other people have to then make up the tax revenue, for example. All right. So a few comics here that I have found about the race to the bottom, right? You have all these people lined up here racing to the bottom. Looks like the gates of hell there. This one here is about this guy. I like this one here. And then here with this question, and the winner of this week's race to the bottom is, and the people standing behind the lecterns: job security, benefits, pensions, wages, safety. All of these things are cost. So there is an awareness that the pursuit of competitive advantages and the consequences of that of environmental damage and threatening workers and worker safety were all issues that were brought up in what was called the Doha Development Round. So Doha was actually they met in Doha, Qatar. That's how you pronounce that, Qatar, that country. It's pronounced Qatar. So they began meeting in 2001 to discuss some of this. So part of the idea was to reduce some trade barriers, and where they saw the trade barriers were with agriculture and related services. Well, these talks collapsed because you had countries that did not want to eliminate or reduce their agricultural subsidies. So the U.S., for example, in 2019 provided about or well over $22 billion in sorry, that's my dog there. $22 billion that went from us taxpayers, right, to, we often say farmers, but where that money, most of it goes, is the agricultural business, the corporations. So that means the United States agriculture industry gets a $22 billion head start over that of other countries. And so that is seen as a trade advantage for the United States. And so you have farmers that are in smaller countries, lesser developed countries, that simply can't compete, right? Because the actual cost of doing business is driven lower because of these massive subsidies that the United States provides to its agricultural industry. So you might be shocked by that that dollar amount, as I hope you are. It's good to know where your tax money's going. Oh, and by the way, when we don't have enough money, then the United States government borrows it, and then your tax money then goes into the subsidies and paying the interest on the debt of the loans that it took to provide these subsidies. So bad on bad. Okay, so I like to call this evolution delayed because it's the evolution of the World Trade Organization, right? So again, the effort to make globalization more inclusive, to help the world's poor and to help them and the poor working people that are in the agriculture industry, particularly those in the ag industry, again, there was this effort to reduce the barriers and subsidies, but that has failed, right? It has not passed to date. The European Union, or the EU, is another political region that also provides massive amounts of agricultural subsidies. So these things are seen as trade barriers. So all this kind of leads to this question about, well, who's the boss? Who's really running stuff, like in terms of the world economy? does the WTO's enforcement capabilities, when disputes are raised, and the Uruguay round, all those new rules, does that mean that that the WTO then begins to encroach into the domestic policy of other countries, right? Of independent individual countries. And if it does, then does the WTO essentially replace democracy in these countries with their policies, which many will see as socialistic because it's created by people who are not elected to the WTO? And then this other question is there an effective shift in public health, safety, and environment and social concerns from democratically elected bodies to the WTO tribunals? So in other words, are we now relying on the WTO to decide on issues of health and safety and environment and social issues because they're the ones who are controlling the economy? So then that begins to affect people's viewpoint of what democracy is and if we really have it. We then have to ask this question then about the WTO, is that where in their decision-making framework are they considering sustainability and the ongoing health and safety of the environment and that of workers and worker rights? Okay, so let's talk about the good and bad. So very briefly, the WTO for the good, right? That the WTO brings peace and solves disputes, brings growth and jobs, sets rules, and raises standards of living. And by doing all these things, it just makes the way the world economy work much more efficient. Okay, so the good, right? You got the angel there. And now let's look at the other side, the bad, right? So the bad side with the WTO was that it doesn't respect the environment, that it increases employment insecurity. It can be bad for your health and safety because of the, some things I'll bring up in just a bit, that it increases inequality amongst the world, that it is exploitive, right, of workers, and that it threatens the sovereignty of nations and democracy. And then there's the ugly, the good, the bad, the ugly. So there's been many protests about global trade. There's even been movies made about this one here, the Seattle protest of 1999. That was a really big deal because it showed that people were aware of what the WTO was, that it existed, and what its implications were. And so people came out, and there was riots in Seattle, and then it happened again in Cancun, and then again in Hong Kong. And since that, the WTO meetings tend to be held in places where it's very difficult for the public to get to. So let's talk about administering these WTO trade agreements. So members then that represent their country will meet to negotiate trade agreements. So here's where one of the debates is that there are representatives that are unelected. So they're not on any ballot. They are appointed, so they are unelected people. So the next is that trade agreements get set, and then the WTO can then enforce them. So what that means is that if you're a member of the WTO, you have to commit to agreements that is agreed to by the WTO. And if a country feels that another country is in breach of an agreement, they can bring that dispute to the WTO for resolution. So it's like going to court, right? You can take somebody to the WTO court if you believe that they are not following the rules of the WTO. So when these disputes are brought to the WTO, there's a panel of judges, and they decide if there's been a barrier to free trade, because that's the key thing they're looking at, is there how does this relate to free trade? That's what the issue's as always about. Their decisions will always work to support free trade. So the decision then is brought to a dispute settlement body, which is the General Counsel in another form, and then they make they take that decision. So the dispute settlement body has the sole authority to establish these panels, and these panels can accept or reject findings that are brought to them, and they can also hear appeals, and they can make decisions on the appeals. And if they do make a finding and the offending country does not change their practice or make amends, the WTO can authorize retaliation to that country when that country does not comply. So here's how the dispute settlement looks in the scheme of the organizational chart. So how long would it take to settle a dispute? Because that's important, because you can have a country that's getting impacted by the actions of another. They want to take it to the WTO court. Well, it could take about a year to a year and 3 months to go through the process of having consultations and meetings and mediation, having panelists that are appointed, and reports that get filed, and then the dispute board meeting, and then adopting a report, and then after that is done, then there can be an appeals period, and that could last another 60 to 90 days. And then even after that happens, either side can appeal the ruling. They can't make an appeal of the appeal, but either side can appeal the original finding. And much like U.S. courts, it has to be based on the points of law, not about a re-examination of evidence or bringing up new issues. So the appeal is heard by a small committee, and the members of that committee have 4-year terms, and those members have to have knowledge of law and international law, and they can't be affiliated with any of these governments. So those of you that are thinking about law school, excuse me, that's something to think about. And so this appeals board can uphold or modify or reverse a legal finding, and the dispute settlement body then must accept or reject this report within 30 days. And rejection of this decision of the appellate body can only happen by consensus. That means that they all have to agree. Sorry if that sounds too legalese, but that's I thought it's important you understand that there is a dispute process and an appeals to the dispute process available. So once the case is decided, now what? So does the country go to jail? Do they not pass go? Do they not collect their $200? Well, no, that's not how it works. But it's the same sentiments. If a country is found, quote unquote, guilty, then they should swiftly correct its fault. And if they don't, then there may be a requirement for them to pay additional compensation or suffer some sort of a penalty. So let's discuss a few disputes that have come up. And I'm not going to get into depth in any one of these, but I just want to share them with you. So the first one that ever happened was when the U.S. had to weaken the Clean Air Act to comply with a complaint that was filed by Venezuela. Venezuela felt that the U.S. Clean Air Act created a trade dispute because it violated a free trade agreement. So the U.S. ended up having to comply to a WTO ruling, and which resulted in more annual emissions of NO2 from imported gasoline. So that's important to recognize. The second case is the U.S. dolphin protection laws that were undermined. In 2008, Mexico raised complaints with the WTO about the U.S. import restrictions and its use of dolphin-safe labeling on tuna products. So perhaps you've seen that label on tuna that you've purchased. So it went to the WTO's dispute settlement system, and in January of 2019 the WTO ended up ruling in favor of the U.S. Now this took a long time because there were claims and counterclaims, new claims that were made, and there's a really good discussion of it on Wikipedia. And you can also look at the WTO website if you'd like to get some more information on this. I'm just trying to point out that there have been disputes, and here's just a few examples. So another one was about sea turtle protections that are provided for in the United States in the Endangered Species Act, or the ESA. So the ESA protects endangered turtles from shrimp harvesting techniques, right? So shrimp sold in the U.S. must use this, what's called an excluder device, and the United States even provided this excluder device to countries in the Caribbean. In the WTO case, there were Southeastern Asian countries that brought the case against the United States because they believed that they were being discriminated against. So the WTO ended up ruling against the United States and the Endangered Species Act and its rules that protected sea turtles from getting killed in shrimpers' nets. So the judges of the WTO said that it's not their task to review the desirability or necessity of sea turtle conservation. So essentially what they're saying is that their decisions are again limited to that of free trade. And so this brings up the question of, does the WTO then have authority over domestic laws like we have in the United States in the Endangered Species Act? So this is an extraordinarily important issue to be aware of. Okay, so bottom line with that is that turtle exclusion devices could no longer be required to be used by shrimpers worldwide for the U.S. market. Another issue would be in food safety. So the European nations did not like that the United States used artificial hormones in their beef. So beef cattle in the U.S. that was treated with artificial hormones. The United States beef and biotech industries then brought a dispute to the WTO, saying that they had that the actions of Europe to not accept these products was in fact an infringement on free trade. The EU, the European Union, was found out of compliance and then required to pay $116 million in tariffs. Okay, so a little bit about labor rights. Labor standards are a prominent issue that faced the WTO, and it's generated a wealth of debate amongst academics. So the key thing to understand is that the WTO does not have jurisdiction over labor standards. Again, remember the WTO is basically focuses on free trade, not the implications of free trade on the environment and people. So incorporating labor rights into the WTO is a question of law and economics and politics, all of which were driven by ethics. This is going to be a debate that will continue to go on for a number of years. However, it's hoped for that the WTO would recognize some of the labor standards that have been in the principles that are in the conventions of International Labor Organization. There's different human rights treaties, and more prominently would be the International Bill of Human Rights, which you can find by Googling it. You can look that up and see it. So let's do this. Let's talk about 10 benefits of the WTO, then we'll talk about 10 reasons to oppose the WTO. So I'm not trying to take a side on one or the other, but I do want to just point out the arguments, right? That's what I'm trying to do here, is just point out what the arguments are. So the benefits include that it helps keep the peace, right? It was created after World War II, and we've not broken into world conflict since then. Yes, there's been wars, but these relationships between countries decrease possibilities of political conflict that lead to war. That disputes are handled constructively. This is number 2. Because dispute rulings are based on agreements. The agreements are negotiated by the countries themselves, so they work to conform to the decisions of themselves. Next is that another benefit would be that it has created a system that's based on rules, not necessarily power, but rules that help move the world closer to equality. Not that they're at equality, but that helps move us towards equality. So, and these rules are made by consensus, which means that everyone has to agree to them, and that all countries have equal rights to dispute the trade policies of other countries. So large and small countries have this ability to negotiate with their trading partners, and it has to be done on a fair basis when you're granted most favored nation status. So number 4 would be freer trade cuts the cost of living, lower costs because of more production, greater range of products and qualities of products. There's more things that are available. I recently saw breadfruit at Costco, so that was surprising to see that, because it's not it's from other countries, right? Not grown here in the U.S. That trade raises income. There's been a dramatic reduction in global poverty around the world, and most of that is attributed to global trade, and of course the work of aid workers. Number 7 would be that trade stimulates economic growth, which helps with employment, meaning more people can have jobs. It's estimated that the United States has gained about 12 million jobs because of increased trade. In Mexico, people are making more money because of trade, so trade has increased their amount of pay. Number 8 is that the principles of the WTO cut cost through efficiency. Number 9 is that governments are protected from lobbying of narrow interest groups. And what that means is that governments are restricted from adopting tariffs to protect a particular interest group, meaning an industry. And that the WTO rules encourage good government because they have requirements for transparency and trade facilitation and non-discrimination. Now let's look at the other side. The first and top one would be that the WTO is fundamentally undemocratic. So the WTO rules are tend to be written by corporations with inside access to negotiations. So the powerful are writing these rules, and that citizen input tends to be ignored because they don't have the power and influence of more powerful economic interest. And most importantly here about that the WTO being fundamentally undemocratic is that the representatives are unelected. The second argument is that the WTO will not make us safer. The WTO says that they're working on creating a world free of trade that promotes global understanding and peace. Yet, to the contrary, the domination of international trade by rich countries for the benefit of their interest fuels anger and resentment with people from other countries, and then that makes us less safe. So, for example, the conflict in the Middle East, what happened in 9/11, some of that is attributed to that countries have felt that, and people within these countries are feeling threatened by powerful interests in the U.S., and so they strike out with things like terrorism. And the argument then would be that if we're going to have real global security, then we have to have international agreements that respect people's rights to democracy and trade systems that promote global justice and sustaining the environment. Excuse me. The third is that the WTO tramples on labor and human rights, that it puts the rights of corporations to profit over human and labor rights, that it's encouragement of a race to the bottom in wages and environment because it pits workers against each other from one country to another to reduce their safety standards in order to drive costs down. Now there's more to it than that. Move on in the interest of time. There's another, number 4, is that the WTO has an interest in privatizing essential services like selling energy and water and healthcare, and that privatization means selling off public assets. So these public assets are things like radio airwaves, and if you control the median, then you control the message. Selling off interests like schools, etc. And other things like childcare, sewage systems, garbage collection, maintenance of things, telecommunications, all these things that can move from being publicly owned to privately owned. And which means that now you have to generate profits, and profits go to typically countries that are international and not necessarily. So what you have is companies that are extracting money from countries, and as they pursue profit and privatizing formerly publicly owned services. The next, number 5, is that the WTO contributes to destroying the environment, and that's because of increased consumption and the attempts to deregulate environmental laws that provide for environmental protection. Number 6 is that people are actually being killed because of WTO actions. That the WTO, for example, protected pharmaceutical companies' right to profit against governments seeking to protect people's health by providing life-saving medicines. Number 7 would be increasing inequality. So we know that the rich have been getting richer and the poor poorer. We've been through that in an earlier lecture. That the WTO actually has been one of the reasons that this has been happening, that there's been more transference of wealth from poor to richer. Number 8 is that the WTO is actually increasing hunger around the world, that farmers produce enough food to feed everyone, Yet because of the corporate control of the food distribution system, many people continue to suffer from chronic malnutrition. The United Nations has the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, saying that food is a human right and that developing countries should have a right to these products, particularly because as many as 4 out of 5 people in the world make their living on the land, and they should be they should not be they should have the availability to have access to the food that is made available through our massive food distribution systems. Okay, so there's more to it than that, but again, I will move on. But I do want to point out that the WTO policies have allowed the dumping of heavily subsidized industrial produced food into poor countries, and then that undermines local production, and then that in fact can increase hunger. Number 9 is that the WTO hurts smaller, poorer countries in favor of richer nations. And number 10, that it undermines local level decision making and national sovereignty. So there's some examples here on this slide, which you could look at your own leisure. So conclusions here about reasons to oppose the WTO is that it's pro-business and anti-consumer, pro-oligarchy, it's anti-democratic, pro-plutocracy, which basically means that government's being ruled by the wealthy, and it's anti-quality of life and pro-control of information and anti-informed consent. All very serious accusations. And that it basically puts the rights of corporations to profit over human and labor rights and environmental protection. The WTO has responded to this by saying that its member governments consider protection of the environment and health legitimate objectives for their policies, and they acknowledge that measures designed to meet objectives could hinder exports, meaning what they do can make things worse, but they agree that sustainable development has to happen, and that can happen through improved access to markets. So they're kind of arguing to maintain their existing system. At least that's how I read this. But they've also pointed out that environment, labor, and competition policies are not in the interest of free trade and the WTO. So they're kind of saying that they focus strictly on free trade, and so they're just going to continue to ignore these issues, because their policy is in their charter is clearly stated to only function to remove trade barriers and solve disputes, that they are not responsible to set environmental and labor standards. And so it says it doesn't have any real power to make these rules. Nonetheless, in 1994, they did create a Committee on Trade and the Environment, and so we'll have to see if that is effective in improving relations with people and the environment. And they have also adopted what was called the sanitary and phytosanitary measures. These were about food and food safety, because you had issues about food being grown in some areas of the world with massive amounts of herbicides and pesticides that would then go to another country and being consumed. So, for example, China was recognized as having a problem with using chemicals and things like melamine on food products, and then people in the U.S. consuming these products. So there was a great consternation from countries about this. So the WTO took action to promote food safety. I'm still not so sure I actually trust that personally. So the WTO argues that balance is needed. They have to balance the environment with the economy. And I've always been troubled by that argument because there is no such thing as balance when it comes to things like your health. I mean, how much poison are you willing to consume in your diet? How much exploitation of the human of another human are you willing to be part of so that you can consume a particular product like a t-shirt or a pair of socks or jewelry? So there is no real balance when it comes to things like this, and if the environment isn't sustained and if human rights aren't respected, then nothing is. So the issues for the WTO to resolve is pursuing sustainability, reducing poverty, respecting property and human rights, and the sovereignty of other nations. These are, as I see, these key issues. Another is for them not to weaken environmental standards and to enable developing countries to participate in developing international standards at the earliest stage of development. So in other words, they are currently shut out of these negotiations, mostly because they can't afford to have people there. But they need to have that problem needs to be resolved, and there has to be more weight to identify opportunities and then to make those opportunities work, right, for trade in a way that promotes sustainability and human rights. So conclusions here is that the breadth and depth of local, national, and environmental and global environmental issues, all those things that we discussed in the introductory lectures, make it clear that the environment has these slow changes, and then wham, there's a massive change. All of a sudden, the environment cannot continue to take any more pollution, and the soil is run off, the soil is depleted, for example, the air is polluted with greenhouse gases, and then you have you have massive collapses. These are all just parts of how ecology works. So we need to avoid these temptations to exert economic and political power to usurp others for personal and political gain. We have to avoid political and economic issues and that lead to environmental instability, and we have to avoid creating a tragedy of the commons, which is what happens when environmental systems collapse. So what does that mean? It means that we need to create and support an ethic that consistently implements decisions that respect ecological limits and human rights. Okay? Political leadership and the will to act on sustainability is what has to happen. Managing by crisis is really a bad idea because it means you're acting too late, right? Okay, so we have the capability of doing this. We have the data. The data's not always perfect, but there's enough of it that we can be moving in a more progressive direction that will provide for more sustainability for everyone. And we can adjust our implementation of decisions as we improve our scientific knowledge and our political knowledge. So we can improve over time, but the key is to start acting in for the benefits of sustainability. So we know that global trade's here to stay. It's better to guide it than to ignore it, right? Better to guide it than to ignore it. Corporations are going to always seek their best interest. That's how that works. We know that the WTO acts largely in the interest of business, but they could act on policies for product and food safety and labor rights and environmental protection and sustainability. They can do that if they choose to do so. Yet they will always be difficult to change because it's controlled by people who, as I see it, overly focus on profit and hide behind that charge of how they were created, and by doing that they overlook fundamental issues and the need of sustainability. So the answers to all these questions and which way we're going to go, well, it's your world, it's your future, it's your decision. It's things that you will act on in your future. All right, all. Take care. See you at the next one.